On the final night before the rope was meant to end his breathing, Silas Crow sat alone beneath the half-built gallows, his wrists free but his fate fixed, the lantern above him swaying as if even the light were uneasy about what was coming, and the wind moved through the empty street of Red Hollow with a sound like quiet voices arguing with the dark, for this town had always been loud in the daylight and cruel after sunset, and now it stood still, waiting for a man it had already decided was a monster. Silas had been called many things in his 38 years: outlaw, butcher, devil of the borderlands, and he had worn those names like a coat that grew heavier with every mile he rode, but tonight there was no one to perform for, no sheriff watching, no crowd thirsting for justice or blood, only the creak of wood, the smell of dust and old iron, and the memories he had buried so deep even he sometimes believed they were lies. Yet as the night stretched long and unforgiving, those memories rose like ghosts that refused to be turned away. He leaned back against the gallows post, feeling the rough grain bite into his skin, and laughed softly at the thought that this structure, so carefully built, would never know the truth of him, because gallows did not listen, and towns did not ask questions once fear had chosen its story. But still, Silas spoke, his voice low and steady, as if the night itself deserved an answer, and he began where the legend always began, with blood, but he told it differently, not as gunfire and screaming horses, but as a boy standing in tall grass watching his father lowered into the ground without a prayer because the preacher said some men were beyond forgiveness, a boy learning early that mercy was a word other people used when it cost them nothing. He spoke of the first time he ran, not from the law but from a home that had become a place of quiet cruelty, where hunger taught lessons sharper than any knife, and he admitted that stealing had come easy, violence easier still once the world had shown him how little it cared whether he lived or died. Yet even as he confessed to the acts that had earned him his reputation, the train ambush at Dry Creek, the saloon fire in Bitter Rock, the dead men whose faces followed him in his sleep, he lingered on moments the stories never told, moments where he had chosen restraint and no one noticed, moments where he turned his horse away from a farm because he saw a child watching from the porch, moments where he paid for a meal with money taken from a man who would never miss it, and the wind seemed to slow as if it were listening more closely. Because this was not the confession the law wanted, this was not repentance offered for forgiveness, this was a reckoning spoken into emptiness, and when Silas finally reached the secret, the one no poster ever hinted at, his voice faltered for the first time, for the truth was not about a crime, but about a mercy that had shaped everything that followed. Years ago, during a botched robbery near the Black Mesa Trail, he had found a young woman bleeding in the dust, caught in the crossfire of men who would later swear Silas murdered her. And instead of leaving her as the legend demanded, he had carried her for miles through the night, past rattlesnakes and dry riverbeds, whispering to her to stay awake even as his own strength failed, and when he reached a small mission settlement at dawn, he left her at the door with his last dollar and rode away before anyone could see his face, because saving her would not erase the dead behind him, and he knew the world did not allow men like him to become heroes, and that woman, whose name he never learned, became the line he never crossed again. The reason his violence narrowed, the reason his gun grew slower to rise, though it was already too late to change how history would remember him. Silas admitted that the lawman who captured him, Marshal Edwin Hale, had once been his friend, a boy who shared his bread and his dreams before choosing the badge, and that when they faced each other for the last time, guns drawn in the red light of evening, Silas could have killed him and walked free, but he did not, because he was tired, because the running had hollowed him out, and because part of him believed that if he finally stopped, the killing might stop with him. And as he spoke these words to the empty night, the lantern flickered and the wind carried his confession beyond the gallows, over rooftops and sleeping homes, as if the town itself might one day feel the weight of what it had refused to hear. Silas ended where he began, not asking for mercy, not denying his sins, but claiming his humanity in a place that had stripped it from him. And when his voice finally fell silent, the night did not answer. The gallows did not tremble, and the legend of the outlaw remained unchanged, for now, but somewhere beyond Red Hollow, beyond the reach of rope and judgment, the truth had been spoken aloud, and once spoken, it could never fully be buried again. They first noticed her at dawn, when the desert light turned Red Mesa the color of old wounds and the wind carried dust through the narrow street like a warning, and she rode in alone on a gray horse with tired eyes, dressed in black not as a show of mourning but as if grief had settled there and refused to leave. Her name whispered before she ever spoke it, Marybelle Ashcroft, the widow of Red Mesa, a woman men feared not because she carried a gun but because death seemed to follow the men who loved her, and The town of Cinder Flats, already thin-skinned from drought and violence, watched her pass with shutters half closed and hands resting uneasily near holsters, for stories had arrived long before she did, stories of outlaws found cold beside campfires, of knife fights ending beneath moonless skies, of graves marked only by stones and the memory of a woman who never cried in public. Maribel rented the smallest adobe house at the edge of town where the land fell away into open desert, and she lived quietly, tending a small garden that struggled against the sun, buying only what she needed, speaking only when spoken to, yet every man who looked at her felt the pull of something dangerous and sad, like standing too close to a cliff at night, because her beauty was not bright but deep, worn smooth by loss, and her eyes held the kind of patience that came from surviving things most people never named. The men who remembered the past said she had once loved a border raider named Thomas Reed, shot down outside Yuma, then a gambler called Eli Navarro, knifed in a back room over debts that were never fully explained, and later a quiet outlaw named Jonah Pike who died bleeding in the sand after a posse mistook him for someone else, and though Maribel never confirmed these stories, she never denied them either, and silence, in the West, often spoke louder than truth. Weeks passed, and the town settled into its careful distance from her, until one evening when the heat refused to break and the sky burned red even after sunset, fate staggered up her path in the form of a wounded gunslinger named Caleb Holt, who collapsed at her door with blood soaking through his coat and dust caked to his lips, and Maribel found him just before the night claimed him, her first instinct not fear but weariness, because she had seen this shape before, felt this weight in her arms, yet still she dragged him inside, cleaned the wound with steady hands, and stitched flesh by lamplight as if saving a life were simply another chore she had never been allowed to refuse. Caleb drifted in and out of fever, murmuring names that did not belong to her, haunted by regrets that surfaced in broken phrases, and as Maribel sat beside him through the long hours, she felt the old ache return, the dangerous softness she had sworn she would never carry again, because love, for her, had always ended in dirt and gun smoke. Yet when Caleb finally opened his eyes and looked at her as if she were the first safe place he had ever known, something shifted. Quiet and terrifying, he stayed hidden in her house while his strength returned, for men were already asking questions in town, and Maribel learned his story in fragments, how he had once ridden with a gang that burned homesteads for coin, how he left after refusing an order that crossed a line he could not unsee, how the wound in his side came from a man who called him brother before pulling the trigger, and she recognized in him the same tired resolve she had seen in others, men who wanted to stop running but did not know where to stand. Still, days turned into weeks, and their closeness grew in the quiet ways that mattered, shared meals eaten slowly, conversations held in low voices as the night cooled, moments where their hands brushed and neither pulled away, yet always there was the shadow, the unspoken understanding that loving her carried a price, and Caleb, despite the warning etched into every rumor, did not pretend ignorance, for one evening as the desert wind pressed against the windows, he said, "I know what they say about you," and Maribel met his gaze without anger or fear and replied, "Then you know why you should leave," and he shook his head, not brave but certain in a way that frightened her more than recklessness, telling her that death followed men like him regardless, that at least with her there was honesty, and in that moment she felt the trap close, not of fate, but of choice. When Caleb healed enough to walk the town streets, eyes followed them everywhere, and danger returned like a scent on the air, for the men he fled were not finished with him, and one afternoon Maribel found a mark carved into her door, a sign she had seen before, a promise of violence disguised as warning, and she knew then that the past had found her again, as it always did, but this time it had found something worth protecting, and that knowledge filled her with both warmth and dread. The night the gunman came, the moon was high and the desert silent, and Caleb stood in the doorway with his revolver loose in his hand, not eager, not afraid, just resigned, while Maribel watched from behind him, her heart breaking in advance because she had loved enough men to recognize the shape of goodbye, and though she begged him not to step outside, he turned and kissed her forehead gently, a touch filled with more sorrow than passion, and said, "If I don't, they'll never stop," and the gunfight that followed was quick and brutal, shots tearing through the stillness, bodies falling into dust that would remember none of it by morning, and when silence returned, Caleb lay wounded again, worse than before, and Maribel held him as life slipped away in shallow breaths, the desert sky vast and uncaring above them. He died with his hand in hers, not promising forever, not apologizing, only thanking her for giving him a place where he was more than his worst choices, and when dawn came, the town of Cinder Flats found the widow alone once more, digging another grave beyond the edge of the mesa, her face calm, her grief private, and the stories grew heavier, more certain, sealing her legend tighter than before, yet none of them captured the truth, that Maribel Ashcroft was not a curse, not a bringer of death, but a woman who loved broken men in a world that broke them faster than love ever could. And beneath the burning western sun, as she stood beside fresh earth and whispered a goodbye the desert would never repeat, fate wove its cruel pattern again, leaving behind not justice or meaning, but the quiet, tragic proof that even the most dangerous love was still love all the same. Deadwood Crossing looked like a place already buried, its buildings sagging under years of neglect, its streets cut deep with wagon ruts and old blood, and when Thomas called a road in at dusk, dust clinging to his coat and pain etched into every line of his face, no one came out to greet him because Deadwood Crossing had learned long ago that greetings only brought trouble, and law had not worn a badge here in nearly 7 years, not since the night the old jail burned and the marshal was dragged through the street behind a horse, and Thomas knew all of this because he had been there, because the memory of that night lived inside him like a wound that never sealed. He rode slowly, his horse favoring one leg as badly as he favored his own, and the badge pinned beneath his coat felt heavier than iron, for it was not a symbol of pride but of failure, one he had sworn never to wear again after the town of Black Willow fell to violence under his watch, after he chose the wrong man to trust, and paid for it with lives that could not be returned, including the life of his younger brother Samuel, who believed in the law more fiercely than Thomas ever had. Deadwood Crossing was his last stop before disappearing for good, a place to trade his horse, maybe find a quiet corner to fade into, but fate had other plans, because as soon as he dismounted, he saw the fear in the eyes watching him from behind shutters, the same fear he had seen in towns already lost, and when a young boy ran past him clutching his arm and whispered, "They are coming back tonight," Thomas understood that this place was standing on the edge of something violent and final. The men who ruled Deadwood Crossing called themselves businessmen now, but they were killers wearing clean coats, led by a man named Grant Holloway, once a deputy under Thomas years ago, a man who smiled easily and shot without hesitation, a man Thomas had let walk away when he should have been buried in a cell, and that mistake had echoed across counties, leaving graves in its wake, and now Holloway had claimed this town as his own, bleeding it dry while promising protection he never intended to give. Thomas tried to keep his head down, but trouble had a way of finding men who carried guilt, and when he stepped into the saloon for water and quiet, he found neither, only Holloway's men already there, their eyes sharp, their hands resting too comfortably near their guns, and Holloway himself leaning against the bar, older, broader, his smile cutting as ever, greeting Thomas by name as if welcoming an old friend, mocking the limp, the weariness, the badge he noticed only when Thomas moved, and in that moment the past and present collided, because Holloway laughed and said the town didn't need a marshal, that Deadwood Crossing belonged to men who knew how to keep order through fear, and Thomas felt the familiar pull of walking away, of surviving by leaving others to their fate. Yet when he looked around and saw the townsfolk frozen in silence, he saw his brother's face among them, saw Black Willow burning again, and something inside him hardened. That night, Thomas pinned the badge openly to his coat and stood in the middle of the street as the sun sank red behind the hills, announcing to no one and everyone that he was the marshal of Deadwood Crossing now, and laughter followed him, sharp and cruel, because one broken man could not stand against an army of hired guns, but the town listened anyway. Because hope, even thin hope, was dangerous but irresistible, preparation came quickly and without comfort, Thomas gathering what little remained of the town's courage, teaching men who had never fired under pressure how to hold a rifle steady, showing women how to load and reload without panic, fortifying doors and windows with boards that had once been part of better dreams, and through it all, the ghosts returned stronger than ever, Samuel's voice questioning every choice, every order, reminding Thomas that leadership carried a cost that could not be paid twice. And on the eve of the attack, when Holloway's riders gathered beyond the ridge, fires glowing like distant stars, Thomas walked the empty jailhouse and finally spoke aloud the truth he had buried for years, that he was afraid, not of dying, but of failing again, of surviving while others paid the price. Dawn came hard and bright, and the fight arrived with it, gunfire tearing through the stillness, windows shattering, horses screaming as chaos flooded the street, and Thomas moved through it like a man already dead, calm and deliberate, placing himself where the danger was thickest, drawing fire away from those who could not defend themselves, shouting orders that carried over the noise because they were rooted in certainty, not bravado. And when Holloway confronted him in the smoke near the burnt-out church, revolver raised, the moment stretched thin, both men knowing how this would end, and Holloway accused Thomas of hypocrisy, of pretending this was about justice when it was really about easing his own conscience, and Thomas did not deny it, because truth mattered now more than pride, and he told Holloway that maybe it was about guilt, maybe it was about paying a debt too long ignored, but it was also about stopping the harm here and now, and when the guns fired, the sound echoed off the hills like judgment, Holloway falling into the dust he had spread across so many lives. The fighting ended soon after, the remaining men fleeing once their leader fell, leaving Deadwood Crossing scarred but standing, and as the dust settled and the wounded were tended, Thomas sat on the jail steps, blood seeping from a new wound, exhaustion dragging him down, yet for the first time in years, the weight on his chest eased, because the ghosts were quieter, not gone, but listening now instead of accusing. The town did not cheer wildly or celebrate, because they understood the cost, but they brought him water, bandages, quiet gratitude, and when someone asked if he would stay, if he would truly be their marshal, Thomas looked at the badge in his hand, worn and scratched, and realized that wearing it no longer felt like punishment, but responsibility accepted at last, and as the sun dipped low over Deadwood Crossing, painting the town in gold instead of blood, Thomas Calder stood, straight despite the pain, knowing the war was over but the work had just begun, and for the first time since Black Willow burned, he believed that redemption was not found in running from the past, but in standing where it had once broken you and choosing, again and again, to hold the line. Black Canyon did not welcome men, it endured them, its walls rising like the ribs of some ancient beast scorched by sun and time, and when Jonah Mercer rode toward it with a rolled map tucked inside his coat and desperation pressed tight against his heart, he already knew the stories well enough to fear them, for every prospector west of the San Pedro had heard whispers of the gold vein hidden deep within the canyon's throat, a seam so rich it gleamed even in shadow, and so cursed that no man who claimed it ever lived to spend a single coin. Yet hunger had a way of dulling wisdom, and Jonah had been hungry for too long, not just for money but for proof that his life had not been wasted chasing dust across the frontier. He was a thin man with careful eyes and hands worn raw by years of digging where others had already failed, and when the map came to him, passed silently across a table by a dying surveyor who smelled of whiskey and regret, Jonah did not ask how it was made or why it had never been followed to its end, because the man's final words were warning enough, whispered through cracked lips as the lantern flickered low. The canyon listens, yet Jonah folded the map away and left before dawn, telling himself that fear was just another obstacle meant to turn weaker men aside. The desert journey was long and punishing, and by the second night Jonah began to notice things he could not explain, a sense of being followed though the land lay empty, the sound of murmurs carried on the wind that spoke his name when no one else could have known it, and he blamed the heat, the isolation, the way hope can twist into something sharp when it grows unchecked. But as he drew closer to Black Canyon, the whispers grew clearer, no longer wind but voices layered atop one another, promising rest, wealth, vindication, telling him he was chosen where others were not, that the gold had waited for him specifically, and though fear tightened his chest, another feeling rose beside it, recognition, as if the canyon had been waiting, patient and certain. The entrance yawned wide and dark, swallowing sound and light alike, and when Jonah stepped inside, the air cooled unnaturally, carrying the scent of damp stone and something older, and the map led him deeper, past carvings worn into the rock that looked less like markings and more like scars, until he reached a narrow chamber where the walls glittered faintly even without torchlight, the gold vein running through the stone like a living thing, pulsing softly as if it breathed. And in that moment Jonah forgot every warning, every grave left behind by men who chased the same dream, because awe has a way of silencing caution, and he fell to his knees, laughing softly, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on his face as he touched the rock and felt warmth beneath his fingers. The voices welcomed him then, no longer distant but intimate, each one carrying a familiar tone. His father's disappointment, his mother's exhausted hope, the laughter of men who once mocked his failures. And they spoke not of damnation but of fairness, insisting that the world owed him this reward after all he had endured, asking only that he listen, that he remember, that he accept the truth that some fortunes were meant to be taken regardless of cost. Jonah worked for days in the canyon, carving gold from stone with a fervor that bordered on reverence, sleeping little, eating less, driven by a sense of urgency he could not name. And each night the whispers grew stronger, no longer content with praise but pressing him to go deeper, to widen the chamber, to uncover what lay beneath the visible seam. And when he hesitated, shadows moved at the edge of his vision, taking the shape of men bent under pickaxes, faces hollow and eyes bright with madness, and he understood then that the gold did not kill directly, it consumed, hollowing men out until only desire remained. Jonah began to change, his thoughts narrowing, his memories bending to serve the hunger, until one evening, as he loaded his saddlebags with gold heavy enough to break a weaker man, he heard footsteps echoing through the canyon, and fear pierced him sharply for the first time, because fear threatened loss, and loss was now unbearable, and when he followed the sound, he found not another prospector but himself, or something wearing his shape, standing in the shadows with eyes that reflected the gold's glow and a smile that felt like betrayal. And the voice that spoke from that figure was calm and patient, telling him the truth at last, that the gold was never cursed by the devil, because it had never belonged to him, that it was born of men's greed laid so thick over generations it gained a will of its own, feeding on longing and despair, and that every man who came here left something behind, whether blood, sanity, or soul. Jonah ran then, fleeing the chamber with gold dragging him down, the canyon seeming to narrow and twist as if reshaping itself to keep him close, the whispers turning sharp and angry, accusing him of ingratitude, of cowardice, of believing he deserved more than others, and when he finally burst into daylight, the desert sun blinding and merciless, he collapsed onto the sand and laughed hysterically, convinced he had escaped, convinced the voices could not follow him beyond the canyon's mouth, yet even as relief washed over him, he realized the whispers had not faded, only softened, now coming from within, reminding him that he carried the gold, and the gold carried the canyon. Jonah returned to civilization weeks later, richer than any man had a right to be, but thinner, quieter, his eyes always searching shadows, and though he tried to spend the gold, tried to bury it beneath land deeds and supplies and promises of a better future, misfortune followed him relentlessly, fires, sickness, accidents that defied explanation, and people began to avoid him, sensing the weight he carried without understanding its source, and at night he dreamed of Black Canyon opening wide, of voices calling him home, and in those dreams he walked willingly back into the dark, because the truth he could no longer escape was simple and cruel. The gold had never been meant to leave, and neither had the men who claimed it. Years later, when Jonah Mercer vanished without a trace, leaving behind only abandoned wealth and a half-burned journal warning others to turn back while they still could, the stories grew once more, changing shape as all legends do, but the canyon remained, silent and waiting, its walls glittering faintly in the dark, and somewhere deep within, the whispers continued, patient as stone, ready to promise everything to the next desperate soul who believed that fortune could be taken without paying the price.